Hello, this is a brief overview of Romanticism as it emerged in the early 19th century. Just kind of three quick notes. First, there will be a quiz at the end of this lecture, so make sure that you get online afterward and fill it in. Second, this is a lecture you should be taking notes on. I'll put some content from this on the exam, but that I'm using a lot of artwork and kind of abstract concepts in this lecture, so your notes should include more than what is simply on the screen. For instance, in the next slide, I'll have a few pictures of classically oriented artwork, but in fact, I have like 8 or 9 points I'm trying to cover, and so track not just what's on the screen, but what the lecture is covering. And the third is to kind of give you a bit of a tip. We've covered the United States and France and England in a great deal of detail, and the only attention we really paid to Germany so far is Kant. But Kant's not simply German. He's a great first-rate modern philosopher. So this lecture is, in a sense, the space where I'm treating what makes Germany unique or exceptional during the 19th century. We'll do more, but this is a key place to plug in that information. Okay, Romanticism. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines Romanticism as that idea that imagination and emotion are the keys to personal development. I broaden personal development just a bit to include both the notion of the individual self, but also the development of that self as part of a larger whole or community. And so Romanticism in particular is interested in the relationship between the self and the broader community, between the self and time, future, past, and also the self and kind of development, how one can become better, although that was in the Stanford definition. To understand just how revolutionary Romanticism was, you need to have a sense of Romanticism as it's situated in the previous 2,000 years of thought. The classical tradition, going back to the Greeks in, I think, the 4th century BC, emphasized a set of propositions that had a stunning longevity over the course of Western history. And Romanticism represents not the first assault, but in some ways the decisive assault in modernity on classical ideas of natural law, virtue as knowledge, nature as having a purpose that allows us to kind of develop our lives. Those three things I want to talk about in this first slide as that sort of thing that leads us forward. The first sort of virtue as knowledge, Socrates sort of thought that the first duty of person was to know yourself, but that the self-knowledge would proceed on a rational basis. And you know that Augustine would sort of supplement that to say that, well, to know God is really to know oneself properly. And then the classical tradition, they synthesized the classical tradition and the Christian tradition. I mean, in the medieval world of St. Thomas, they synthesized classical and medieval. And then in the modern era of the Enlightenment and Reformation and the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of the classics. And so the classics remained from Socrates to about 1800, a dominant way that people understood the world. Even in the Enlightenment, when they talked about science as a way of knowing the rational world around us, they were in many ways still sort of implementing Aristotle's method. Now, I mean, Aristotle emphasized observational science, and the Enlightenment sciences wanted to experiment and calculate and use mathematics. And there were key distinctions. But the fact is that the Enlightenment believed with Aristotle that reality could be apprehended with one's mind and with one's reason, first and foremost. The second is a little more complicated, and that's where I want to use these pictures, is to talk about nature as having a purpose. So the classics talked a lot about, when looked to nature as a model, both the romanticism of, say, the 19th century of Wordsworth and Shelley, and the world of Aristotle and Augustine talk a lot about nature and the natural world and human nature as a source of identity. But part of what's so confusing is they mean very different things by it. So when the classics approached human nature, they thought you were looking at not what was just actually there, but the way things ought to be, about our purpose, about how we were designed to operate. So they weren't afraid when producing a piece of work to describe nature that they were going to describe the ideal, and an ideal that probably couldn't actually be achieved, but that one was going to aim at, right? So Michelangelo's David, off here to the side, David, the statue of David is larger than life. It's perfect. It's probably more perfect than David actually was. I don't imagine the scrawny kind of 16-year-old kid who's getting ready to fight Goliath having pecs like that, having abs like that, having muscles like that. He wasn't 7 feet tall. He probably didn't fight Goliath in the nude, but they're sort of creating an ideal about what it means to be human. Look at the Garden of Versailles here below my picture. The idea there is not that you've just captured this wilderness space and you want to create things the way that God had created. The classical world really thought that perhaps when we think God's own thoughts after him, we want to shape a garden the way that God had shaped the Garden of Eden, and it will be ordered and it will be beautiful and it will be symmetrical, the way things ought to be, maybe not the way things are out in the wild. And then take a look at this third painting dating from the French Revolution by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Horatii. These young men are swearing an oath that they're going to pledge themselves to this cause of violence against the tyrants, violence against the Tarquin king who is sort of oppressing Rome. And when Jacques-Louis David wants to think about patriotism, he has to appeal to this classical idea. He doesn't actually paint, the French Revolution or the state as it existed in the 18th century. The classics for people living in the 1700s were a better model for the way we ought to live our lives than maybe what we actually had available to us in the moment. And Romanticism displaces that. Whereas the gardens of Versailles give us elegance and restraint and proportion and ratios, Romanticism wants to give us authenticity. It wants to give us what we desire. It's going to give us a dynamic, changing, evolving, kind of not a perpetually static fountain that's always doing, but a water feature that might be wild and chaotic and captures the power and the danger of nature. If classical law emphasized moral truths that were for all time in all places available to the reason of the best minds, the Romantics thought that truth could be accessed by the individual mind, and that it was not going to be the same in all times and places. Because we were, remember Kant's insight, our moral truth is sort of filtered through our noumena, our phenomenal mind, and so we don't all perceive things the same way. So whereas for the classics, truth was about detachment from oneself, you see that in the picture of the Horatii here, or detachment from the way our bodies actually are in pursuit of an ideal of what might be. The Romantics aren't going to define ideals in terms of detachment. It's not possible. They're going to define it in terms of intensity of passion and of these kind of longings or ineffable desires that we have for something bigger than ourselves. If the classical garden or the Enlightenment garden is about the humans shaping and perfecting the way things are toward the way things ought to be, this unattainable event horizon, Romantics wanted communion with the untamed wild, with the wilderness. Thoreau wants to go out onto the pond and think about the nature of wildness and how he can be, it's going to give him some emotional insight rather than detachment. And this is a real break with the classical world. Ever since the medieval period, ever since Rome, ever since with Aquinas, ever since the Renaissance, even in the French Revolution and in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they're looking back to the classics as a model. The Romantics jettison that. They're not looking for something that's true everywhere. They want something that's going to be true for them. So a Scottish romantic like Sir Walter Scott is going to find it in Christian epics. A British romantic might find it in Arthurian legend. German romantics are going to find it in folk songs. You're reading a piece by Johann Gottlieb Bysshe, who talks about finding it in German barbarians rather than in this timeless rational tradition. Okay, enough kind of examples. What I want to do now is approach the actual definition, talk in abstraction a little bit, and then finish with some more kind of concrete examples. So remember, the Stanford definition talks about how Romanticism is that imagination and emotion are the key to what I'm calling self-formation. This is an intensely German expression. Many more people beyond Germany, like Victor Hugo, or Robert Browning, or Keats, or Shelley, or Byron, or Thoreau, or Whitman. Like this is a broad movement. You see it in Tolstoy, you see it in Nietzsche. But the people who developed it first were Germans, and they were trying to find a way to assert German uniqueness over and against the French revolutionary model, against Napoleon, and then against kind of the developing British imperial system and industrialism. The key insights here, the first two major developments I have, draw from a set of lectures that Isaiah Berlin gave. You can find them on YouTube. There's 6 of them. They're dense, they're witty, but it's way more than what you need. It's really more the material for a graduate seminar. But Berlin argues that the intellectual key to understanding the romantic self is understanding that the will is at the center of it. So they're developing Kant's insight that we are free, autonomous persons with access to truth. And that to be true to oneself is the most fundamentally creative thing that you can do. That's the way in which you find truth. They argued that we are not determined by our ends. We are not determined by our programming or by pure reason or by even really a destiny given to us by our creator, but that we determine our own destiny. That's what it means to be really free. And that's what we ought to celebrate. So an authentic person, an authentic hero who comes to their own end and meets a tragic demise. Maybe that person, maybe they really are heroic. So the Romantics really wrestle with someone like Napoleon. On the one hand, Napoleon was a kind of tyrant who dictated his will upon Europe. And so to the extent that he didn't free other people, but made them follow his law, Romantics think that's bad. But he's a genius. And he sort of does his own thing. And I mean, yeah, maybe he squashed the freedom of a few dozen million Germans, but they find that really sympathetic. They don't react with horror, but they act with a kind of he was true to himself, is what we would say today, right? Nations are the same way, the Germans believe, right? So the German nation might have its own kind of autonomous will, and we'll see this idea then develop in Hegel and in kind of German nationalism. So if the self is interested in kind of looking inward to find truth, the relationship between nature and the Romantics is also a really kind of core part of who they were. They wanted to displace the classical view of nature as static and having a fixed and final purpose with a view of nature that was actually deeply chaotic. So the Romantics did want to spend a lot of time looking at nature. And so look at the imagery in the poems I've assigned. In particular, you have the field of daffodils. What feelings does the field of daffodils evoke? Ask yourself that question. Or Byron's view of the ocean. The Romantics wanted to draw the conclusion that the universe actually emerges, the moral universe emerges from our own self-creation. Nature doesn't come pre-programmed with a fixed universe. It does not have a form of self-organization. It does not have an intrinsic plan. Now today we take these ideas and we link them intensely to the kind of the moral universe of Darwin, but note that Darwin is behind the times by about 100 years. Darwin in some ways is creating scientific observations. That's romantic language. Darwin doesn't believe he's creating the observations. He's not in that sense a romantic, but people kind of read Darwin in light of a movement that was already there. So what does nature teach us when we look at nature? A romantic would say, you want to understand Houghton, you want to understand the world around Houghton, don't sit on that beautifully symmetrical quad in front of the chapel. That's been engineered, it's artificial. Go to the field of dreams. And you'll see there a human attempt to impose order, right? So an Enlightenment person would say, oh, look at the science of the solar array, isn't that wonderful? A classicist would say, well, look at the scene of pastoral beauty in the cornfield and in the perfectly mowed grass. Or romantics to say, a romantic is going to point you to three other features. Look at the beaver dam. Look at the animals sort of tearing down the trees. Look at the wildness of nature and the Japanese knotweed on the east side. How it's just, it wants to take over the field. It wants to resist. Or the wild grapes kind of wreaking havoc on the carefully designed, like nature is wild. The Greeks had a word for this that the Romantics sort of developed, and it's often used to describe the artwork. We'll turn again to, this is a word I want you to learn. The word is chthonic, C-T-H-O-N-I-C. Like write that down in your notes. A chthonic world is a world that's savage, that's kind of like a giant cafeteria. It's not a well-ordered kingdom of animals. It's not the lamb and the lion lying down next to each other, right? And the Romantics want to say to understand that world, you have to feel it. To kind of catalog it, to make a catalog of all the butterflies in nature, you gotta stick a pin in them and kill them. How artificial. Wordsworth writes, we murder to dissect, right? You don't want to study nature that way. You want to feel it. In addition to this, like this is sort of an insight I've sort of been working on as a historian. The Romantics really thought that truth then, if you can't study it scientifically, that doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist, but it means it's ineffable. It's in the form of these myths or stories that kind of talk about who we are. So the Romantics really wanted to crack the code of our nature by looking at kind of the history of our tribes, the history of our nations. The brothers Grimm became obsessed with cataloging the fairy tales of medieval Germany, right? So one thing you might do to kind of think about, Romanticism this week is read the old medieval version of Cinderella. I'll give you a link to it, right? And look at, this is not a Disney, this is not a sanitized sort of happy Cinderella. It's violent, it's surprising, it's whimsical. Nature is not fully under control. We're not really fully in control of our own selves. You also see this in this picture that I've given you here. Thomas Cole's depiction of the Falls of the Catskill. Thomas Cole is an English artist. He's a romantic. He comes to America to experience nature. He goes up the Hudson. Look at the way nature is presented in this picture. Okay, you have what's at the center. You have this waterfall with a rainbow. But if you look around, your eye is drawn toward scenes that aren't quite harmonious, right? You've got the colors changing, which suggests beauty and decay. You have a dark storm looming on the horizon. And look at the violence of the waterfall, how it's smashed the trees and how death has sort of gnarled this old kind of titan of the forest. Notice too kind of what is the human relationship to nature in this picture? A question that you should probably be asking of your poetry and of Frankenstein, right? Is there a human person? Well, yes. But unlike the classical tradition, which would see man as the culmination of all things, this picture doesn't see man that way, right? The human person is small. Maybe it's a she. She's not in control. She's powerless. She's an observer. She's subject to the violence of nature and the beauty of nature. And so yeah, to be a romantic is to commune, but not necessarily to be fully in domination over. a couple more examples of the way this works, and you can see, so you can see on one side a couple of examples I have of how Romanticism works, and then I have the text that we're going to read this week, which will help you to think about what Romanticism is. Just really quickly, it's Bildung. So it's possible to overplay the tension between Enlightenment science and Romanticism. Full-blown German Romantics detested science. But in fact, what Kant had done, and what many of the kind of people who implemented Romanticism was to say, science is it's not enough to make you fully human, right? Remember what Kant said, each fully developed human needs to use their reason and form their self, to form their moral senses in terms of their duty to all of humanity, right? And the Romantics understood that this was going to take a fair amount of effort. So Bildung is, the word in German means formation. It's best understood as a mode of ethical and cultural cultivation or self-realization that allows the individual to grow and mature and assume responsibility and assume independence, right? And this is inside. One's feelings become the tools with which one does this. It's particularly, it helps you balance reason and industry with sense. And this is something that everyone has to do for themselves. It's generally seen as being done through the educational process. So it's the liberal arts education we have at Houghton. I'm not saying it's romantic, but it was in some ways created in the 19th century in a romantic age, in which what we were trying to do is balance the needs of the professions with kind of the character and moral formation of the whole person. And at Houghton in the Wesleyan institution, kind of the Christian tradition would have been seen as an intrinsic part of that. If you want more on that, the Stanford site on Romanticism has got some great insights into what Bildung is. I also see this kind of, like, I'm a legal scholar, so let me tell you for a minute about kind of what's happening in law, right? Traditionally in law was seen as coming from specific spaces, and it could be rationally known, and that it was unchanging, right? So Cicero said, true law is right reason. A statesman, a philosopher king, can sit down and think about why murder is wrong and come to transcendent moral knowledge from the natural law about why murder is wrong. It's unchanging, okay? The imperial code of the Middle Ages was Justinian law from the Byzantine Empire. And they would say, well, everyone knows that murder is wrong, and it's, Justinian codified it. So we have this absolute emperor who tells us this thing, but it's not like law is changing. It's not fuzzy. The emperor said it, that finishes it, right? Well, the Romantics are going to say, well, law comes from tradition, and it's developmental. So in the 19th century, American legal scholars developed this obsession with the common law as a source of kind of moral authority, right? The English common law evolved over centuries. And so this developed under the American legal theorist Oliver Wendell Holmes. Well, I see is very much influenced by Romanticism as what we today would call a living constitution or a developing constitution that changes from age to age and situation. But that's a romantic way of thinking about what the law is, right? I've already talked about Grimm's fairy tales. I don't need to develop that very much. But just this idea that, if you want to know what it means to be German, you look at our stories and our myths, and these tales are about sublime feeling and horror and terror and awe, all of the things I want you to think about in Frankenstein. Okay, let me give you two more examples connected to music, which we're not formally doing with the class, but if you want to understand German Romanticism, the Germans were involved, but music is what they were considered to be the best at. So let's talk a little bit about Beethoven. Beethoven's dates are 1770 to 1827. So he lives at the heart of this transformation. He doesn't completely destroy the old tradition. He's not a modern 20th century composer. But he so comes to define modern kind of classical music that we forget that he was actually really kind of blowing things up in a way. So the old music of Mozart and Bach are focused on harmonies, on counterpoint, on balance. They're performed in a court setting. And they're not about trying to make you feel as much as possible, but about balance and symmetry and ebb and flow. Wagner actually said that Beethoven's great advantage was that he went deaf. And that as he started to go deaf, he was undisturbed by the noise of society and was able to listen to the harmonies of his own soul. That's a romantic way of thinking about music, right? And we forget that Beethoven was not well understood by court audiences at the turn of the 19th century. One critic sort of describes him as bizarre. He takes the majestic flight of the eagle and then creeps along rock-strewn paths. After penetrating the soul with a gentle melancholy, he immediately lacerates it with a mouth of barbarous chords. I seem to see the doves put in together with the crocodiles. The Beethoven just wants you to feel, and it's loud, and everything is there all at once, and it's jumbled, and we may not perceive it that way today because we see authentic music as making us feel. Critics weren't so sure what to do with Beethoven. And in fact, the musical canons so dramatically changed at the beginning of the 19th century that it changed the way they performed older pieces of music. So if you know anything about Don Giovanni, the culmination of the opera, I'm going to give it away, so plug your ears if you don't want to know, is that Don Giovanni basically gets taken down into hell by these infernal forces in judgment for all of the havoc that he's wreaked on the cast of the opera. He's been pursuing his own power and his own desires and his own mischief. And he's like, it's about what he wants. And he's destroyed at the end. And then Mozart doesn't want to end the story there. There's a sextet in which the six major kind of protagonists kind of tie up the opera with a nice, neat little bow. And there's balance, and it's light, and it's happy, and it's beautiful, and it's harmonious. And that's the way the opera was performed then. And if you go see it today, they brought it back because it's authentic. But in the 19th century, they didn't do the conclusion because they hated it. They wanted Don Giovanni to be the hero, not the villain. Because what could be more authentic than this character, this genius who pursues his tragic passions to the hilt? That's what life is like. That's an authentic individual. And so, concluding here with the devil, right? I mean, you also see this radical rethinking about the way Paradise Lost was taught. I didn't teach it last semester, but if you took Professor Sharp, emphasizes Paradise Lost. And the devil is, I mean, he's really beautifully portrayed by Milton in Paradise Lost, but he's the enemy. And his revolution brings chaos and pandemonium and destroys God's carefully wrought order. And the will, our will in Paradise Lost, is properly subjected to God, and it allows us the freedom to choose him. We have freedom to do the good. Well, in the 19th century, people weren't interested in that. And so they rewrote the way they thought about. I mean, these classic texts are kind of examined in new ways. That's a sign that everything's been blown up in art. And a lot of what we're going to do in terms of the literature for the next 6 weeks is wrestle with how has this changed everything. It changes music. It changes nationalistic politics. It changes art. It changes the novel. It changes drama. It changes existential philosophy. It makes Nietzsche, like it just, everything seems to unfold from this moment. So let's talk about it. I want to have kind of some discussions about this, one in which we kind of talk about, so I've given you 4 poems there and a piece by Fichte there. We'll start with those, look at those, and see if you can identify Romanticism in these pieces, the relationship to nature, the relationship to myth, and the relationship to the will. Look for those 3 things. And then start on Frankenstein. So I promised a quiz question. Here's the quiz question. The question is I used a Greek word one slide ago, and the word is chthonic, C-T-H-O-N-I-C. What does it mean? What in the world does it have to do with Romanticism? And that's the question. And I look forward to what I hope are going to be great discussions this week where we kind of unpack these ideas and we talk about the extent to which we are and are not romantic in our souls. All right? Thank you very much.